Johan, thank you for your lovely setup introduction yesterday, and thank you, Mother Nature, for providing the finale for Johan's talk by just descending upon us exactly on cue. So that was great. But what Johan talked about, planetary boundaries, I actually see them, and thank you, Adam, for this idea. I see them as time bombs. So Adam and Jessica and we were having dinner last night, and we thought, these are time bombs. It's basically the coral reef time bomb that could be any time now, the next bleaching event. The amphibians time bomb. It's the climate time bomb, which we know by if we don't change course by 2020, we've got problems. There's a phosphorus time bomb, which very few people understand. So what are we? We need to redefine ourselves. We are actually a time bomb disposal squad. Congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, you have a new job. So, and of course, we are in Mission Impossible. I can't do tunes very well, but just mentally play that tune and you get exactly, that's the one, yes. What is Mission Impossible? Many of these time bombs are actually set for in the next decade or so, let's say 2020, round it up. So we have actually a very steep challenge of changing resource use, changing economic direction, and doing all of that, all of these time bombs being diffused by 2020. As Jakob rightly points out, that doesn't mean the solution is there on 2020, but the direction ought to have changed by then, and the actions required to change that direction should have been taken. This needs toolkit, this needs equipment. So what equipment is this bomb disposal squad going to use? So I'm going to share with you two pieces of equipment, and both are knowledge pieces. One knowledge piece, I'm thankful to my colleagues and friends in the TEEB community, and for the other, an equivalent large community called the Green Economy Group. So what was TEEB's most important lesson? It was to do with the significance of nature to the poor. Nature is not just a luxury for the rich, it's a necessity for the poor. This is something that we've said many, many times. What does this mean? If you look at ecosystem services and measure them and try and value them, and we've done all that, and you get to small answers. Like we did 3 studies in TEEB, one for Indonesia, one for Brazil, one for India. And typically ecosystem services are 10, 16, 21% if you see them in percentage of GDP terms, the missing value that we don't account for. But that's the wrong division. That's the wrong question to ask. It's not about total ecosystem services. Who actually suffers when the forests die? Well, number one, it's the poor farmer, because the nutrients and the fresh water that came from the forest through the aquifers to the fields of the poor farmer are no longer coming to him. So he needs to rely on expensive irrigation and expensive fertilizers. Who suffers when you can't go to the forest and collect fuel wood? And I know we want everyone to use cook stoves, but today we are still at a stage where most people use fuel wood. 60% of humanity, by some estimates, still into that. It's the poor farmer's wife who suffers because she doesn't have access to the fuel wood. Who suffers if goats and cattle can't go into the forest to forage for leaf litter because the forests are too far away? Once again, the poor farmer. So when we ask the right question, which is not what are ecosystem services as a percentage of GDP, because that's the wrong numerator, frankly, and the wrong denominator, but what are ecosystem services as a fraction of the consumption of the poor household, then the answer is, well, if we look at in Brazil, 20 million people who are nuts and gatherers, as high as 90%. If you look at India, 350 million people who are either subsistence farmers or forest-dependent tribals. 50% of their livelihood incomes, basically their household incomes, are coming free to them from the forests. These are the people who suffer. So the question is not what are ecosystem services as a percentage of GDP, because that's neither here nor there. The real question is what are ecosystem services used and consumed by the poor household as a percentage of the GDP of the poor? When you do that, the answer isn't 5, 10, 15%. It's more like 50, 75, and 90%. These are the 3 countries we studied. Indonesia was another 100 million people who are basically subsistence farmers. Why is this important? Because this point, which is basically an economic demonstration of the value of ecosystem services, this point completely kills the usual argument that you hear from politicians and from some businessmen, which is that there is a trade-off, they keep telling you. There is a trade-off between environmental governance, environmental responsibility on the one hand, and economic progress on the other. If you want environmental sustainability, you must be anti-poor. You must be against development. And I challenge them to pick anything wrong with these calculations. The answer is that is not the case. That is basically a wrong pitch that has been made for decades. We believed it because we didn't have the time or the energy or the effort to explore what was going on. So if this is the case, if what I'm describing to you is true, and I swear that these facts are research facts, why don't things change? Why don't we all across governments start investing in the livelihoods of the poor and then therefore conserve forests, because these are actually the wealth of the poor? We don't, because we are into GDP. And GDP basically, for those who know finance and economics will probably remember from their university and school days, GDP is basically measured in terms of income. So it's corporate profits, it's salaries, it's net bank interest, it's net rentals. We add all that up and you get GDP. What are the big important pieces out there? Corporate profits. If the poor farmer or his wife has access to the nutrients and the fresh water and the fuel wood of the forest, does that make a jot of a difference to corporate profits? Not at all, because these are not corporate profits that we are talking about. These are the livelihoods of the poor. Does it add to the big salaries of all of the employees, 70% of whom are employed by corporations? No, because these are poor farmers. They are mostly unofficial, unrecorded labor. So it doesn't make a jot of a difference to GDP. So there's no interest in a politician, or for that matter in a businessman who is demanding certain directions for the politician, to actually support this into implementation. But this is part of your toolkit, ladies and gentlemen. Bomb disposal squad. Got to use this, right? Now I come to my other, because this demolition piece basically destroys the main argument against environmental sustainability. Next argument comes from the green economy, about agriculture. You know, today we have a situation where when we do the statistics, we find that there are about 525 million farms around the world. 400 million of those farms are actually small farms, which means less than 2 hectares. 2 hectares, which means they're basically subsistence farmers. Now, 2 studies were done, one by Julius Pretty, an agricultural scientist, and a few others in 2006, another one by the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, 2009, which basically said that if you look at small farms and you look at their productivity, if you apply ecologically friendly methods, then you do see increases in yield. In the case of Julius Pretty, his sample was statistically quite important. It was 285 projects or schemes around the world across 57 developing countries, covering more than 12 million farms. And on average, his group found that yields went up 79% on average. So just do the maths. So we are talking about how much area do these 400 million farms cover? It's about 60% of the arable land on earth. How much food do they produce? About half the food on earth. So if we could get every one of these small farms to be producing 79 or 80% more, rounded up, 8 5s are 40, that means 40% more food on earth. Who is producing it? The poorest people who produce it for their families and the local market. Would that make a difference? Yes, it would make differences on 2 minor issues. One is something called hunger, because you would have 40% more food. And the other is in the incomes of the poor, because these 400 million farms employ 1 billion farmers, and upon them depend 2.6 billion people. So their incomes would have gone up by that much as well. So you would have solved another problem called poverty. So by focusing on the small farm, you could actually have gone a long way towards solving the problems of hunger and poverty. Minor issues, of course. So I ask again the question, why doesn't this happen? It's blindingly obvious. And once again, my answer, sadly, is the same. Because the increasing in the income of the small farmers doesn't actually add to corporate profits. How would it increase the profits of the top 4 seed companies or the top 10 fertilizer companies if all of these jokers decided to use ecologically friendly methods and stop buying seeds every year and going bankrupt and borrowing and then ending up with the debt traps? How would it help if they stopped buying fertilizers for increasing yield? Because we've been telling them for the last 50 years that what you need is more fertilizers and better pesticides. So it doesn't, again, help the corporate profit objective. It doesn't increase GDP as we measure it today. Corporate profits, salaries, net interest, net incomes, net rentals. So therefore, we don't do this either. But the fact that we know this, a large group now knows this, is your instrument number 2. So the toolkit is increasing. The equipment is increasing. Okay? But these are just pieces of information, knowledge that I love to communicate because large groups have researched them and brought them across. But what do we need to change is basically the corporation, because its purpose is profit. It has lost its deep connection to society. Society is no longer the purpose of the corporation. And to change it, and it's not an easy change, we need to look at what's driving problems at the macro level and identify the few things that need to change at the micro as at the corporate levels. So the big problems at the macro level are excessive demand, we know that, and that demand is basically goods and services, more production, more materials, more energy, and more of the wrong kind of energy. The second problem is too cheap supply. The reason why demand can be met and increase and volume becomes the source of profits as against quality or value. The reason for that is because production is too cheap, because it's not accounting for externalities, it's not accounting for the scarcity of resources, and it's not accounting for the costs of financial recessions. Third problem is, of course, resource scarcity itself. Natural resources are getting scarce. And the fourth problem is externalities. The fact that business as usual creates costs estimated for the top 3,000 companies at something like $2.2 trillion. Jochen talked yesterday about how his company, and he took the lead in terms of producing an EP&L, disclosing voluntarily what was their externalities. And that can be done. Interestingly, each of the four challenges that I talk about, which are macro level big problems, does have a driver. It is consumerism, marketing and advertising that is driving the demand explosion. It is basically the problem of externalities not accounted for and resource not being correctly priced that's driving supply being too cheap. It's the fact that we tax the goods and not the bads. We tax hard work as in incomes. We tax corporate profits as in ingenuity. We do not tax the bads as in resource extraction and resource use. That is driving the problem of resource scarcity. And finally, we do not even measure, let alone report externalities. And we can solve each and every one of these four problems. Accountable advertising is possible. Resource taxation is possible. Disclosure of externalities is possible. We've seen an example of that from Jochen yesterday. And indeed, limiting leverage, basically making sure that finance doesn't become something that creates companies that are too big to fail. In the old days, only banks were too big to fail, but of course now insurance companies, AIG, car companies, General Motors, airlines, Swiss Air, even hedge funds, how can I forget, LTCM, too big to fail. You know, can you just imagine LTCM being considered like a Mother Teresa charity that we must save these poor fellows, you know? Come on. So we have issues, we have problems at the macro level, we have causes of these problems at the micro or the corporate level, and we have solutions. The thing is, we are not using the toolkit. We are not attacking the points where action can result, and we don't have that much time. So I'll close with this image. Johan, the planetary boundaries that you described yesterday, once you said to me the planetary boundaries are not negotiable. I also heard from my colleagues that apparently US President George Bush I had said at an early conference, the first Rio conference, that the American way of life is not negotiable. So what we have is basically two non-negotiable titans. We are witnessing today the clash of two non-negotiable titans. Who knows who's going to win? Or maybe they're both going to lose. Well, we don't want to wait for that. We are a bomb disposal squad unit, and therefore I invite you to the challenge of diffusing all these time bombs. Thank you.